I'm wondering, what do you think those of us that live in the imperial core can learn from China, especially during the COVID-19 pandemic, which has triggered the need for a global response? And how has China demonstrated it's a leader in this effort? Also, what has China proven to be the antidote against U.S. imperialism?
Well, very good questions. I think the biggest thing we can learn from China is that we really need a government that is not controlled by capitalists, finance capitalists, monopoly capitalists. This is, I think, the principal issue and the difference, right? So, there are a lot of people on the left, anarchists, libertarians, whatever it may be, who kind of shame big government and top-down arrangements or whatnot. But I truly do think that any sort of next phase of U.S. development is going to have a pretty big top-down element to it, just because I predict that a lot of people just won't be involved, right, in the revolutions. How do you get people involved? Well, you got to tell them to get involved. You got to tell them to do certain things differently. And so I think one thing that China has really done a great job in developing is what I was describing before, is that it's that kind of government that because it's not controlled by in the interests of private capital, that private capital literally doesn't make policy in China, that has allowed for such a large level of involvement, and this kind of involvement that is both top down and bottom up in nature. And I think that the pandemic response was such a huge part of that, right? China acted very fast because it had already developed mechanisms from its lessons from 2003 SARS outbreak, and it had focused a lot on a pandemic response in the future. So it was able to act fast, and it was able to do things like shut down transportation in Wuhan and travel in and out of Hubei province very rapidly once the outbreak was very clearly going to be at least an epidemic, but eventually it reached pandemic levels. So that level of organization is very important to learn from, because here in the United States, on the one hand, you have the concentration of the state's repressive apparatus in the U.S., and on the other, you have the complete dismantling of any sort of social safety net, social welfare system, social organization, from unions to certain programs that help people in need. So you have that happening at the same time. But in China, it's been the opposite. And this is what is so ironic to me, especially, when the Democrats would get Bernie Sanders, bait him into, anti-China slanders or whatever. He'll say, oh, yeah, they've lifted so many people out of poverty, but I'm not into that dictatorship authoritarianism stuff. What's so interesting about that is that a lot of the reasons why the central government has been successful is because it's actually implemented a lot of the things that I would think that Bernie Sanders supporters would like, people who want things like a Green New Deal. I mean, China is basically implementing its own kind of Green New Deal, producing all of this renewable energy. That's produced a lot of different kinds of jobs that didn't exist beforehand. You have so much production of, windmills, solar panels are everywhere. Even in the oldest parts of these cities, there are solar panels, generating power in these households, like across the board. You cannot go anywhere in China and not see a solar panel somewhere, on the streets, on all of the, economic institutions and people's households. I mean, this is something that just shows the level of effectiveness of a central government, a centralized state that works in the interests of people. And so all the response from the lockdown in Hubei province, which was very effective in curbing the worst of the outbreak, from the ability to just redirect production in a snap, so things like masks and ventilators and that sort of thing were available to the healthcare system. The Communist Party organized 40,000 doctors doctors who were members of the Communist Party, to travel to Hubei province and help them with their shortage of medical supplies, saying, you said you were going to sacrifice for the people, so you're going to sacrifice for the people. A lot of the people who died early on during the outbreak of COVID-19 in China were Communist Party members. I think over 70% of them. It was because they were out there volunteering their time, trying to help people get tested, get into quarantine. So there's just, I think, a huge difference in just the way that a centralized state, when it is in control of the people, in people's hands, when it is really working in their interest, that opens up so many opportunities to not just defeat a pandemic in a very short amount of time, at least at the level of containment, but then to say, well, we're going to lead that effort around the world. And so it's been the exact opposite in the United States. The United States not only bungled its own pandemic response, waiting. I remember I was here in New York City, just absolutely floored by the fact that so many cases had already been confirmed, and all the businesses were just waiting for the local governments to do something about it. And they did nothing about it. It took so long. I think it was mid-March when there started to be any restrictions in New York City. And by then the virus had spread undetected. And we still have that scenario in many ways. Some of these measures have been effective in at least curbing the number of cases and the number of deaths. But at the same time, we're, arguably 3-4 months into this thing and still struggling with the idea of going outside, endangering ourselves. I think having a strong centralized state that works in the interests of people really can do some good things, even if it's not always perfect. Because the SARS outbreak showed that, yes, because of the reforms and all of that, healthcare in China, there's a lot of different issues, but there's been such a level of improvement, right? Not only 95+% of people have access to health insurance, which covers all of the basics, but also just in the way that the central government has invested in things like a pandemic response, like biotechnology. That's partnership with Cuba, which was so integral towards preventing the spread inside of healthcare settings, right? By investing in interferon with the Cuban government that produces so much of this wonderful drug. Being able to do all of this just shows that, not only does China learn from past errors and then improving upon them, but it also has the ability to then take that into a leadership role around the world, which I think is the reason why the U.S. is so hysterical right now, is that it's so scared that its diplomatic, its international prowess, and the fact that the capitalist system is in an economic crisis in the United States that is probably the worst it's ever been. Well, you have a perfect storm of China is going to jump ahead, right? There's all these estimations. Well, China is going to be the largest economy in 2050, 2040, whatever. It could be sooner if the U.S., which in Q1, I think experienced a 5% contracted by 5% negative growth, capitalist crises, developments of a very anarchic social system can really speed things up real fast. That could happen sooner.
Yeah.
So what you're telling me is that when China goes through a crisis, they learn and grow from it.
Yeah, that's that.
Really weird.
I mean, that's exactly what COVID-19 has demonstrated.